This is the 10th of our Academia Bessarion discussions, and it is the presentation of my recently published edition of the writings of Brunetto Latino. I have already given this discussion in Italian, and the slides will be mentioned in Italian. But at this point, we're presenting it with an English version. And this is the beginning of the academia, the presentation. Welcome. And here we see the manuscript, which I use as evidence that Ser Brunetto Latino, with his students who were Guido Cavalcanti, Francesco da Barberino, and Dante Alighieri, was teaching them Buon Governo. This is in a Laurentian library manuscript, and it's a section which begins the Rhetorica. There are four major problems which have caused Brunetto not to be studied very well in the critical literature. Because, first of all, we had Dante placing him in hell, which meant that people rather avoided him. And then we have the sense that the Tesoro was not translated by Brunetto, but by Bono Giamboni. This was because of one late manuscript in the Veneto region, and it's not actually the case in the illustration we have just seen. It is Brunetto reading from his French Livre Trésor, translating it orally into the Tesoro, which his students then write down. And this was the method he had seen observed at the court of Alfonso el Savio, where the scholars, the Hebrew and Arabic scholars, were translating Greek texts into Latin for the king. And then a third problem is that Vittorio Imbriani in Naples in the 19th century declared that Brunetto was far too busy a man to be able to teach these three men. And in fact, Vittorio Imbriani falsified one of the documents he listed, which was actually written before Dante was even born, to make that claim. And in fact, we can tell from the archives that Brunetto was indeed deeply involved in the Buon Governo of Florence in the 1280s and the 1290s when he returned there, and that was the time when these manuscripts were being produced by his students whom he was teaching, both theory and practice at once. And then we also had the problem in the 1640 edition by Federico Ubaldini, where he made the mistake of thinking that the author of the Documenti d'Amore, Regimenti delle Donne, which I should have an extra N, and Il Fiore, was Ser Francesco Neri da Barberino. In fact, it was instead Ser Francesco di Cernadi da Barberino, who was the author, the scribe, and a co-student with Dante and Guido of Brunetto. He has the ambition at first of being a great writer himself, and then he will realize that no, his teacher and his fellow student are greater, and so he sets out to the task of editing their works instead of his own. And here we see in a manuscript that's in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence that the librarian has written on the facing page to the manuscript that is written by Bono Giamboni, and when actually that is information he has taken from a late edition, making that ascription in print. And here is the beginning of Francesco da Barberino's copy of a beautiful copy of the Tesoro, written out in the 1330s. And let me begin by discussing how I have worked with these materials now for 50 years. I'm now 84, the same age that Francesco de Barberino was when he died of plague and was buried in Santa Croce with an epitaphio by Boccaccio. I began by editing the 17 manuscripts of the Tesoretto, which were published by Garland, and I typeset that. And then I was able to continue to work with the materials, publishing a bibliography for Alan Diamond in the series on scholarly bibliographies. And then I was able on my sabbatical to travel all over Europe, studying all the documents written by Brunetto in his own hand. There are 10 of them, 11 of them, 10 of which are signed with his notarial sign, and all of his manuscripts in French and in Italian. And I wrote this book, Twice Told Tales, Dante, Brunetto Latino and Dante Alighieri. And then in 2000, I was asked by the Laurentian Library to republish my Tesoretto edition in a facsimile, which was done in a very limited edition, but which I wish was in the hands of all school children in Italy, because it's such a lovely teaching text with laughter, and from which Dante takes much of his inspiration for the Commedia. And then Sonia Minutelli came to me because she was writing her thesis on this group of manuscripts, not the 1330 ones written by Francesco de Barberino, but those earlier ones written by Guido Cavalcanti, Dante Alighieri, and Francesco de Barberino. He has one of the early ones in the Ambrosian Library. And these manuscripts contained scientific drawings, astronomical drawings, and she was studying them. And they date around the years 1280, 1290. And I was able to find that that was the period when Dante returned to Florence and was very active in both government and in teaching. And I had already begun this idea of creating the edition of Brunetto Latino's writings, and I was doing those manuscripts from the 1330s by the scribe Francesco de Barberino, which I identified with the help of paleographic research of Teresa de Pertis and iconographic research by Francesca Passard. And that became the second volume. So, with the help of the research of Sonia Minutelli, I then created the first volume, editing the manuscripts of the 1280-1290 period, which the Regione Toscana, the government of Tuscany, published as the Tesoro di Brunetto Latino, Maestro di Dante Alighieri, with the TVD, because it was too long to publish as a printed book, in which we give all of the manuscripts in facsimile, and which we then also confront with a facing page of the transcriptions of them, which are diplomatic. They're exactly the same as the manuscripts, except the spacing is modern to make it easier for modern readers to understand. And I found even ordinary Florentines without a university education were able to read it, just as they are also able to read the 700 years old text of Dante Alighieri, because these are the founders of the Italian language. And I'm very grateful to Massimo Seriacopi, who helped me a great deal with the Italian, with which I was not sufficiently proficient. And so in the first book, we have the life of Brunetto Latino. with a transcription of all of his Latin documents of state, the 10 of them, and then over 100 which name him, these being written between 1250 and 1294. The practica, the practice, and then the theory of good government, of his writing and teaching, the Rhetorica, the Tesoretto, the Tesoro, which he first wrote out in 1260 and then again in the 1280s and 1290s with the young students Guido, Dante, and Francesco. Let us begin with the history of the Primo Popolo, of which Brunetto was chancellor, very young age, precocious. They had invented the Fiorino, the Guelph florin of Florence, which is the first European euro. It's modelled on the Agustalis of Federico II, who was Ghibelline, and this was the Guelph response to that, with the figure of John the Baptist and the wild iris, which is Florence's lily, which I have growing here in this cemetery. And then in 1254, we have the peace treaty between Siena and Florence, written out in Dante, in Brunetto's hand, and which is in the Siena State Archives, signed et ego bonectus bonacorsi Latinus. This Latinus would translate into Italian as Latino instead of Latini. And here we again see in 1254, et ego bonectus bonacorsi Latinus notarius, and so forth, in this beautiful hand with the notarial sign of a fountain or lily. And then in the Bargello, they are boasting about how splendid the Primo Popolo is, this tremendously energetic republic of the people's thing. And they create on the wall of it a statement honoring that. And that's in 1255. And Richard McKinley did this wonderful study when he was a Fulbright scholar on this. This is the stone, and it's quoting from Lucan. And then this is the second part of it. Gaudet fortuna signis populaque potenti, que mare, que terram, etc., which is going to be echoed. This will be turned to bitter ashes with the defeat of Monteperti, which will destroy the Primo Popolo of Florence's first republic. But Dante will refer back to it with his Inverno 26, Godi Firenze, poi che sesi grande, che per mare e per terra batti l'ali, e per l'inferno il tuo nome si spande. And then we know that he was also early on writing out orations in Italian of Latin speakers such as Cicero and Cato and Caesar. And he was discussing these again in his Rhetorica, which is a translation of Cicero followed by a commentary, and which he was like Dante with his works, many of his works, unable to finish. But he will dedicate this when he is in exile to a rich banker who is also in exile, whom he calls his porto, his harbor. Much later, the Maestro degli Effigi Domenicani, the illuminator of the Traversian Commedia, will also illustrate a newer version of the Rhetorica written out by Francesco de Barberino. It's a beautiful manuscript with wonderful diagrams, but it is 70 years later, in around 1330. And here you see at the top Cicero, and at the bottom you see Brunetto, but Brunetto in rosa, in pink, which is the way Francesco de Barberino always shows also himself, because in this medieval mode of the scribe writing out the author's work, he becomes like the author. He identifies with him, with his words, and with his whole being, the sense of the book as also the body and the voice of the speaker. And this is before we had recording machines, and the book was a rather primitive way of giving the human voice its phonetics and so forth, using the alphabet to do so. And then we find that Brunetto was writing several pages of the Book of Monteperti. I was able to identify this by means of this design. This is not signed by Brunetto, but it is clearly his hand and this ornament, which you also will find in other documents, such as the one in Westminster Abbey. The Libro di Monteperti is in 1260, and then soon after that, he will leave on embassy for Spain and not be present, although he had promised to be at the Battle of Monteperti. And then he arrives at the court of Alfonso to seek help for Florence against the King Manfred, who is the son of the Emperor Frederick II, illegitimate. And here he is kneeling before Alfonso il Savio X, the wise king. And there, during a brief time, he will acquire the manuscripts of Alfraganus's astronomy, which he will put into the Livre du Trésor, and also Aristotle's Ethics, and which have been translated into Latin in 1244 by Hermann the German in Spain. And these will become the major aspects of his Tesoro and also of Dante's Commedia, arriving in Florence, which was a new raw city, from this wonderful multicultural court, which was very similar to that of Frederick II, but in Spain, in Sevilla. And here we see the actual room where this embassy occurred, the Alcazar, Sevilla, which is still preserved, with its glorious Arabic architecture. And next, Brunetto will pen a poem to send to the wise king to thank him, and it will be the Tesoretto, al valente signore, etc., di cui non somigliare. It praises the king. And then years later, it's going to be also presented to his students, who will be quite different from being kings. They will be young republicans in Florence. So we have this version, which I think is by Dante, which is written out in 1280 when Dante's a teenager. Then disaster, the Battle of Monteperti, and Florence is thoroughly routed. The Guelphs have to go into exile, their buildings are razed to the ground. Dante's father is too inconspicuous to be punished. He's a money lender in Florence, so Dante will end up being born in Florence, while Brunetto will be living in exile in northern France, in Arras. And this is the later version of the Tesoretto with beautiful illustrations by Francesco de Barberino or the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicani. But here he describes the episode in Brunetto's life in 1260 and not 1330, where Brunetto in the pass of Roncesvalles meets a student from Bologna who tells him of the tragedy of the ex, and that his father is now living in Lucca. The bankers will pay Lucca 2,000 lira to support that group of exiles. And possibly this student from Bologna is actually Brunetto's not so popular brother, and who was a student at Bologna. And then this is a document in the Vatican secret archives where the Florentine bankers are arranging for the Decima to be paid to the Pope for his war against Manfred. And you can see the same ornament as you had in the Libro di Monteperti. And then we have this document, which I've already described as being in the Westminster Abbey, again about the Decima with Brunetto's signature, et ego bonectus, and so forth. And then in the poem of the Tesoretto, under the influence of Alain de Lille and possibly of the Roman de la Rose, although they are contemporary, we're not sure which influence is which. Brunetto describes himself going off into a dream landscape where he meets the figure of Natura, who teaches him everything. And this is the book I would so love to put into the hands of school children, with the snails and the grasshoppers. All the animals are present here, and they're absolutely charming, with Adam and Eve up at the top, and so forth. And then he goes to Ovid, who teaches him the art and the remedies of love. There was always this wonderful ambiguity in the courtly love literature, which is also to teach you not to commit adultery by demonstrating what goes wrong when you do, when Lancelot and Guinevere destroy Arthur's Camelot through their lust and so on. And then he meets with Ptolemy, the great astronomy, whose text was created into Arabic and then into Latin from Alfraganus's. And here you see the whole cosmos, which will then become Dante's Paradiso. It has come to Florence by way of Spain and also by way of the Arabic learning. And what happens is that Alfonso wants Florence's help to become emperor, so he will give Florence one of the copies of his gorgeous Canticas de Santa Maria, of all of the miracles of the Virgin, which tend to be quite racist against the Jews and the Arabs, although his father was the king of the three religions, Ferdinando. And Brunetto will present to him his Le Livre du Trésor and his Tesoretto, the Tesoretto now lost, but which was catalogued in the Marquès de Santillana's library. And meanwhile, the bankers realize that Alfonso's got too many domestic problems, his son's revolting against him, that he's not going to be able to come to help Florence. And so they choose instead this warrior count, Carlo d'Anjou, who's already got into trouble with a tax revolt from his citizens in Marseille. And so they've got to sit down and teach him good government. So they get Brunetto to write Le Livre du Trésor, which is a complete account of ethics, of rhetoric, politics, as well as of theology, of the Bible, of astronomy, and all of the animals in the bestiario. It's a wonderful encyclopedia, the first one in the vernacular. And it is presented to Carlo d'Anjou as the podesta. This was the office of the foreigner who was hired for a limited term of office, for instance, for a year. And he was to enforce justice in the city, northern Italian city, like Florence, like Volterra, and so forth. And they create the role for him in Rome to be such, with the misspelling not of senator, but of sanatore, meaning he will be the healer of the city. But he isn't. He's a terrible ruler. He's very cruel. He's kind of a trump. And he takes the oath of office in 1265, in June 1265, and he will in the next year be crowned with his Queen Beatrice as King of Sicily and Jerusalem, as well as being Count of Anjou and of Provence. And These are the texts which Brunetto was producing. He produced them in multiple copies, not only for Carlo himself, Charles of Anjou, but also for all of the heads of state in Europe. And you find them in all of the major European libraries. I was delighted to be able, with the Uriel Pass, to go from library to library to find these gorgeous works produced in northern France, in Picard and French, in Picardy, with French illuminations, but often with Italian scribes. This one is at St. Petersburg. These two are in Geneva, and with the basilisk, which you get in Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, and also the swallow, which is mentioned in Aristotle's Ethics and again in Brunetto's writings twice over when he translates the Ethics into Italian, and also when he is writing about the swallow in the bestiary section. And then what happens is that the Florentines are very unhappy with Carlo's mode of governing. He puts the Ghibelline Count Jordan, who was a very noble, in jail, cuts off his right hand and his right foot and his right eye. And Count Jordan creates this poem, this prayer to his right hand, which is lost, which dubs so many fair knights. And that gets into the later versions of the Tesoro, which are anti-Carlo. They will end up creating peace between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines secretly against Carlo, and secretly work to undermine him. And here you get Gianni di Procida and another named Accardo Latino, who I think is Brunetto Latino, who are present at the court of the King of Aragon. And lots of the Brunetto manuscripts end up in Barcelona and in Girona as a result of this being used to teach kings how to govern republicanly, which is a bit of a paradox. These two also visit the Emperor of Constantinople, the Paleologo. They visit the popes, except the French one, whom Carlo puts in place, who also seeing that Thomas Aquinas is poisoned so that he won't vote against Martin. And also they visit the Genovese and so on. And this will cause the eruption of the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, where they slaughter various members of the French army who are oppressing the Sicilians, forcing them to pay high taxes for an armada of ships to go to Constantinople to loot it as a crusade against Christians. And this is why the Council of Leon actually briefly joined together the Orthodox Church with the Catholic Church, as will happen again at the Council of Florence in the Renaissance, with Cardinal Bessarion reading the document in Florence's Duomo. And here we see also the outbreak in Messina, with the women fighting with the men and carrying the instruments for defending their city against the French. And the wonderful story. At the same time, following this, Carlo's kingdom is reduced not any longer to Sicily, although he still continues to say he's king of Jerusalem, but also he's only now limited to Naples. And he demands that the Florentines, who have to go on pretending to be his allies, create a blockade of foodstuffs to Pisa, whom he is opposing. And so you get this list of wine, grain, meat, cheese, honey, figs, nuts, oil, beans, vegetables, etc., not being allowed to go to Pisa. At the same time that there's a secret embassy by Brunetto Latino and others to Count Ugolino de la Gherardesca, because the Florentines are really on his side where he is governing Pisa. But the people, in their famine and finding that Count uh, Ugolino has been cheating them, he has made the grain so highly priced that they are starving. So they seize him and put him in the tower with his children and grandchildren, the tower named Hunger. And later, when they open the tower, they find he has eaten his children. And the Florentines were so shocked by this war crime that they themselves had caused, that they established or San Michele as a granary to feed even the enemy in time of famine. And you have Guido Cavalcanti describing the miracles that this secular monument causes. And here you see the manuscript from Alfonso El Savio with the Madonna in the tabernacle, creating all of these miracles. And here you see in Villani's history the Madonna in her tabernacle at Or San Michele, not in Sevilla, but in Florence, where she also is creating similar miracles. And what Guido Cavalcanti will say is that the Franciscans and the Dominicans are really quite jealous of this secular monument. I took this photograph before Or San Michele was restored, when it seemed much more holy, always lit with candles. I used to light candles for my children there. And here we see in the Libro del Biadeolo, which is illustrated by the master of the Dominican effigies, where Siena in famine is being fed by the Florentines. You see even the mother with the baby in the fasces. Let's see if I can get my arrow to work. No, but there she is. And these great grain baskets and so forth. And now we turn to Brunetto's teaching. He's no longer on the road as a secret spy for Florence against Carlo. There's one incredible episode that's given in the Tesoro where he and Gianni di Procida actually go to Carlo himself, who doesn't realize they're raising money from Carlo against Carlo. Sheer chutzpah. It's written with the most extraordinary sense of energy and joy against this oppressive ruler who is so unjust. Guido Cavalcanti, Dante Alighieri, Francesco de Barberino, at school with Sir Brunetto in the 1280s, 1290s, but illustrated in the 1330s. And here you see Francesco looking admiringly at Dante, who is holding the tesoro he's writing out from Brunetto's French Le Livre Trésor, which he's translating orally to them. And Dante is dressed in blue as the apprentice. Italian schoolboys and schoolgirls still wear blue aprons when they go to school. And these are the manuscripts. This is possibly Dante's manuscript. And there are two of the Tesoro. There's also had been the one of the Tesoretto in the Ricardian Library. This one is in the Laurentian Library. And this wonderful cosmology with all of the angels lists amongst the angels uomo, man, homo. All of this cluster do that. And even where one of them gets copied out in the Veneto, Sonia Minutelli was studying one in near Udine in San Daniel de Friuli. And here again we see the duplicate of that manuscript. This, I think, is Dante's hand, where you generally have the R going below the line. And then when Francesco de Barberino much later will copy that hand. He will do it with the same kind of cancelleresca, but it's not the same hand. The R is more normal and so forth. And this is where possibly Dante is copying out Brunetto on squaring the circle, which, as we remember, will be in the Paradiso for the description of God. And then Brunetto dies around 1294, and the Torre della Castagna, that is where Dante will be one of the 12 priors from the 15th of June to the 15th of August, right now, in the year 1300. During that time, Corso Donati, who was very eloquent and handsome, but treacherous like a Catiline against Cicero, and will get into a vendetta with Guido Cavalcanti. Brunetto was always writing against vendettas. Just don't pay attention. Don't get violent, because that destroys the peace and the prosperity of the city. The Ghibellines built their towers of pride and were constantly filling the streets with bloodshed, which was why they were exiled by the Guelphs. And then at the Cardinal, or peace of Cardinal Latino, the two parties were joined together with marriages. For instance, Guido marries Beatrice, who is the daughter of Farinata, the great Ghibelline, and so on. And because of this feud between Corso Donati and Guido Cavalcanti, Dante is forced to exile both of them and friend amongst them. And this will cause the death of Guido in the 29th of August 1300, shortly after Dante is released from this tower. They did the voting using chestnuts, which I've got to show here, and that's why the tower is named after the Tower of the Chestnuts. Then in 1301, Corso Donati is seizing power in Florence, although he's a black Guelph, not a white Guelph. He's not peaceable. He's more like the Ghibellines. He's filled with bloodshed and violence and so forth. And he goes and he releases the prisoners from the Stinche, from the prison, in order to have them support him in power. And this will cause the exile and the death, which had already caused the exile and the death of Guido Cavalcanti, and now will cause the exile of Dante. And in the Bargello, we have this Libro del Chiodo. We have made the facsimile of it with the nail. It's always difficult when you go with them. There's the great nail in the middle of it, made out of iron. And in that book, Dante is named 3 times. First, as to be exiled, then, if he ever returns, to be burned to death. And he turns that Libro del Chiodo, the Book of the Nail, its tragedy, into the comedy of the Commedia. And here we are making the facsimile. This is my bookbinder, Enrico Giannini, and my Fabbro, my metalsmith, who is Roma, who does the restoration here in the cemetery, including having restored Donatello's pulpit in Prato, and who's inherited his grandfather's metalworking tools. This is Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu from the Black Sea, from Romania. And then here are the 3 mentions of Dante in the book, with the manicula pointing to Dante's name. Then Guido Corso Donati is killed in 1308. He is the new Catiline of Florence, Dino Campani says. The dream of Camelot and the dream of Florence had been dashed through this violence and so forth. But in exile, Dante will write the Commedia, and in Inferno 15, he will describe himself meeting his now dead teacher. In Botticelli's version, Virgil is in blue and Dante is in red, but generally in the manuscripts, it is Dante in apprentice blue and Virgil in red. And they're also playing the game that Dante is playing the game that Brunetto is below him, stark naked. How many times have we as teachers dreamed of ourselves walking into lecture halls stark naked without our notes and so on and so forth? While up above is Dante uh, on the ridge, and this is reflecting the story, the medieval story of Aristotle being played a joke by Alexander, his student, who is up in the tower looking down and laughing at his teacher, who is walking around the courtyard on all fours with the beautiful golden haired uh, Phyllis on his back. And here again, we see how we get these two colors. The blue for Dante of the apprentice is kind of a Pinocchio figure. He sins all of the seven sins, and we with him because we identify with him. We are learners with him. We are at school with Virgil, with Brunetto, with Beatrice, and so forth, with Bernard. Right. Okay. Inferno 15. The sin is more of Dante than of Brunetto. Dante is in love with his teacher, and that I think is the reason why he is present in this. And we share, as we read Dante's words, this love for who was actually appointed as Dante's guardian at the death of his father by his stepmother. His mother had died when he was just a toddler. And also we have, we have the family of Brunetto was actually from La Lastra, which is right by Fiesole. His father was the notaio, and a notaio in Italian is equal with a judge. I had Charles Davis tell me that Brunetto was not important because he was a mere notaio. Because in America, the notaries are women who sign your document for you, validate it for you for nothing. But it's very expensive to pay a notaio in Europe. It goes directly back to the Roman Empire. They sign their documents with purple ink, and it's quite important. At any rate, Fiesole in Inferno is spoken of negatively with the Macigno, the rock, the Pietra Serena, the galleries, and Montececheri, where Leonardo will practice his flying machine, and it's a disaster. It was just stone rocky galleries for the quarries. And then the English were planted with cypress trees. But that barren landscape you're going to see in the Commedia miniatures, you're going to see it in Renaissance paintings, for instance, of John the Baptist and so forth. But then when you hear of Fiesole in the Paradiso, it will be positive. And there again, Dante is playing game. And also, there's a horoscope in the Biblioteca Nazionale manuscript of the Tesoro, which I used to think was by Dante, and so did Hélène Wieruszowski. But now I think it's more likely by Guido Cavalcanti. It's not in his Cancelleresca, which Leonardo Bruni described. It's in Litera Textualis, a beautiful libraria with round letters, except the horoscope is rather badly drawn. But there was this legend that Dante had had his horoscope written by Brunetto, which gets into the early commentaries. And then we have the reference to the Tesoro, that is to the work in Italian, not that in French, but all of the scholarship just parrots each other, saying, oh, it's to Le Livre du Trésor, which Dante read in French. He didn't. Um, Both Brunetto and Francesco are proficient in French, Latin, and Italian, while Dante only is using Italian and Latin while playing games with Provençal, the other version of French, the southern version. Okay. And then we have this manuscript. What happens, Sonia Minutelli has shown, is that Dante, in his Tesoro version, dictates to his students, not the Alfraganus he'd gained in Spain, which he used in the Le Livre du Trésor, but instead the text of Gersulin de Metz, who describes if you have a hole through the earth and you drop a rock, it would get stuck in the middle through gravity. Now, this is before Newton, who's said to have invented the theory of gravity from the apple falling on his head. Um, but this is Dante's Satan, his Lucifer, who's stuck in the middle of the earth. And then also you have this beautiful interlaced drawing of the squaring of the circle. And let's go on. The second book, we now turn to much later, to Francesco de Barberino. He had already written out the Tesoro, uh, even with marginal notes by Brunetto, which is in the Ambrosian manuscript. And I wish I could get a digitized version of it because it is so important. It's quite beautiful. Francesco actually has a more beautiful hand than Dante has. But now, in the 1330s, he will write out the Rhetorica, the Tesoretto, and the Tesoro, and he being the scriba, the scribe. And this is the text which he has illustrated by the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicane. And I think this is the Tesoretto, that was the Tesoro, where you see Brunetto now instead of giving the book to the king of Spain, now gives it to his student, who is more humbly dressed than he is, and that is Francesco, who is both scribe and the commissioner of the drawings, or perhaps doing the drawings, which will be then completed by the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicane? Or is it possible that the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicane could be Francesco? Not sure. At any rate, this is the handwriting of Et ego Ser Franciscus Neri de Barberino, which Ubaldini had thought was Francesco de Barberino. It is not a very beautiful hand, and this is about the only document we've got in it. We get other documents naming him. And instead, this is the hand of Francesco Zernadi di Barberino, while this had been the hand of Franciscus Neri de Barberino. They're two different people. Sir Franciscus Neri de Barberino drops out of sight after 1308. Sir Franciscus Zernadi de Barberino will continue to 1348, which is an extraordinary, he lives a long life to 84, dying of the plague. And then Ubaldini creates this lovely edition of the Documenti d'Amore, which is here on the table. And beside him is the Libro delle Reggimenti delle Donne and Il Fiore delle Novelle. Whereas in the Tesoretto manuscript by Dante, continued on into the Mare Amoroso. And I think the Mare Amoroso is an exercise set by Brunetto of his young teenager student to create out of the bestiario a kind of love romance with all of the animals. And it's an interesting poem. It's apprentice work. And that it is Francesco who is in Padova who will write out the Fiore, creating out of the Roman de la Rose the series of sonnets, which exist in a manuscript not in his hand or in Dante's hand, but which was in Padua and then went to Dijon and is now in Montpellier. And so that is how I trace the story of that work. At the beginning of 1308, Francesco da Barberino was in Treviso as a notaio to the Podesta Corso Donati, and he was trying to teach him good government by giving him a copy that he'd written out of the Tesoro. And he also frescoed in the bishop's palace the allegory of justice between mercy and conscience. And this material it was first discussed in an essay by Biscari, and then who mentioned that when Corso Donati was called to be Podesta in Treviso at the beginning of 1308, which will be the year when he will die, be killed in Florence, it was given to him the permission joyfully by the Florentines. They really wanted to get rid of him and his violence. Placuit omnibus quasi, and that's in the Consigli della Repubblica. And then Federico Ubaldini, who did make the mistake about the identity of Francesco da Barberino, does though give the information about the fresco. Ordinò altresì in Trevigi, secondo il suo disegno, la pittura della giustizia, della misericordia e della coscienza nella sala del vescovade, perché quelli che quivi giudicava avesse alla dipinta cose particolar riguardo, that it would teach the people governing in that room how to govern with justice, which was not exactly what Corso Donati was doing. So, in a sense, we have Francesco de Barberino with Corso Donati mirroring what Brunetto had tried to do with Carlo d'Anjou, both of them being unsuccessful in teaching their masters justice. But we do have in the Laurentian Library this interesting manuscript which finishes in 1330. It includes Aristotle's Ethics, which Maria Corti thought were actually written out in 1244. It says it's written out in 1244, but that's a reference to when it was translated. The whole manuscript is written out in 1313 by Francesco da Barberino. And that's in Latin, and it also includes parts of Brunetto's writings, but in Latin, because Francesco, his literary executor. And then also we have here in the Ricardian manuscript, a beautiful, sumptuous manuscript written out both of these while Francesco's still in exile from Florence as uh, along with all of the other white Guelphs, along with Dante and so on. He writes this text in Italian, and it has beautiful illuminations by the Maestro dell'Antifoni Padovani in the Padovan region, the Paduan region. And he also, when he's working in Verona for the Doges of Florence, I believe, writes out all of Le Livre du Trésor in French. And then, when he will create his own Tesoro in the 1330s, will translate from that early French 1260 version, the Tesoro version that doesn't include all of the extra chronicle material which Dante's version had about Carlo d'Anjou, about the Sicilian Vespers. He goes right back to the original version, which only has the story of Brunetto's exile and how they are electing Charles. And he also, during this time in exile, creates the Officiolum with this extraordinary creature. She's feminine, but she's sort of like a Geryon creature. You can see she's a woman because she's got these dugs. She's got lion's feet, etc. She's a wild mixture. And she has Francesco under her feet. He all shows himself in pink. And here, Francesco manages to get the upper hand and is shooting arrows at her. And this is when he's probably, along with Dante, writing letters to their dreamed for emperor to come and control Florence and win it back for them. And then in the Documenti d'Amore, we see love shooting arrows at all of these people. And here is Francesca da Barberino again in pink. These author images are, in a sense, their voices, just as you see here on the screen, my image and my speaking. We're going back to the forms of medieval manuscripts in color, in the images, and so forth, which we lost with the printing press. And here we see Brunetto Francesco in pink, Brunetto Francesco in pink in the Rhetorica, and in the translation following the Aristotelian ethics in the Tesoro, both of these drawn by the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicane, who could possibly be Francesco. And then he commissions in the Bargello his own portrait. He's living, he's kneeling, before his patrons, who are the bishop Antonio d'Orso, his teacher, who is Brunetto with the ermine and the red. And this Vasari tells us, now let's see if I can get my arrow to him, this is Corso Donati in paradise, next to Dante Alighieri. Now, this is painted in the same building which holds the Libro del Chiodo, in which Dante is condemned to exile and death. So, what Francesco is doing is rehabilitating Dante and also rehabilitating Corso, as he had tried to rehabilitate him but had not been exactly successful. And this is the Bargello, the Libro del Chiodo. And at the same time, in 1321, the same year that Dante dies, Francesco, we find in documents in Fiesole, uh, commissions a tomb of Tino da Camaino of Antonio d'Orso. And on it, you see the figure of death shooting arrows in both directions. This will be a theme in Francesco's writings. The miniature, the people who do the miniatures in the Officina of Francesco da Barberino include the maestro who does these for the Dante del Cento, which are said to have been commissioned by or written by Francesco da Barberino in order to pay his daughter's dowries. He was a married cleric, and this shows up in the documents in the archives for Ser Francesco da Barberino Senadi. And these are the Trivulzian first pages of Inferno and Purgatorio and Paradiso. And he also, the same miniaturist, does those for the Libro de Baiadolo for or San Michele, and the Rhetorica section in the Tesoro of Brunetto teaching his students. And here is Brunetto at the beginning of this new Tesoro of the 1330s, which reflects back to that in the 1260s. But then there's a child doing miniatures within the manuscript. The child has seen that manuscript by the master of the Padovan antiphonary, but it does these wonderful lively drawings, but they're not polished, they're not mature ones. Here you get the giant Goliath taking up almost half the page, And then I've got the Botticelli giants around like the Monte Regione, the towers, and so forth. And but then we go back to the Maestro delle Figlie Domenicani, where you have the animals, the serpents slithering between the lines. This would be wonderful to illustrate those cantos in the Inferno where Dante has the sinners turning into serpents and vice versa. And here we get the manticore, which is like the Sphinx that was in the Officiolum, but is a terrifying creature and also reflects Dante's Geryon. Why on earth did Dante and Virgil get on to Gerion's back when they knew about this monster who is devouring this man's leg, and you see the blood pouring down and you see the scorpion tail, and surely Virgil is not going to be capable, it's a shade, doesn't cast a shadow, to protect Dante from the scorpion bite, which will be so deadly. And here we see more of the layout of these pages. They are beautiful. Francesco de Barberino really understood how to lay out books. He was also furbo. He knew how to not waste parchment. Dante's manuscripts tend to be on rather bad parchment, and he wastes a lot by spacing too much. Francesco manages to get everything in, narrowly spaced, but still very readable, and is very proficient in his book production, which he has learned from Brunetto, who has learned it from the court of Alfonso a Savio. Francesco is employing the same methods that Alfonso had done with Arabic scribes. This was the Arabic multiple production of texts, with multiple scribes listening to one person dictating the material, which Brunetto then did in exile, relating the Le Livre du Trésor, forse perhaps in Italian, to scribes who were immediately translating it into Picardan French. So this claim that Brunetto sinned because he was writing in French isn't correct, because he was writing a great deal in Italian. And then the iconography of Francesco de Barberino is very interesting. He had been in Padua and seen the Arena Chapel of Giotto, and this is the figure of justice, and this is his own figure of justice in the Tesoro and in the Documenti d'Amore. And this is Ubaldini's figure of justice, illustrated by Nicolas Poussin in the Renaissance, continuing that. Whereas Cecco d'Ascoli, whom unfortunately Francesco de Barberino, as a member of the Inquisition, has condemned to death by burning, and also his book, La Cerba, shows La Giustizia by Pacino di Buonaguida in a different way. And then also Ambrogio Lorenzetti had spent a great deal of time in Florence, even doing okay, that this is his figure of justice in Siena, in the Sala della Pace for Buon Governo in 1338-39, under the influence of Francesco. Brunetto does not do miniatures which show allegories. It is Francesco who adds that to the Brunetton material. And here we see Natura. Yes, she is an allegory, but so probably there I made a mistake. There is Natura teaching Brunetto about all of the animals, the bestiary. And then here is Providentia, in the Tesoro. We see women in the Tesoro and the Officiolum. And then we see the God of Love in the Tesoretto and in the Documenti d'Amore. I really do believe that the maestro delle figlie domenicane is Francesco, because he's said to have illustrated the Documenti d'Amore. And here's the officiolum, which is absolutely splendid, on the ages of man, the child, the old woman. And here in the Tesoro, the final page, is the tree of life with the baby being baptized, the mother with the child playing, the schoolboys, the student, the man in his maturity, and then as he begins to age, and then as he's approaching death. And there we see Francesco under the Sphinx in his pink and then shooting arrows. And then this is the figure of death in the Tesoretto with Francesco Brunetto under him, and as death rides on a pale horse and so forth. And then here we see in the Tesoro death with the two bows shooting arrows, first at this knight, and then beyond the frame, the philosopher in the pink robe. Well, that's sort of Francesco. It's the same joke, which already Brunetto had been joking about in the text, with this dialogue between fear and safety, where fear says, "Aren't you afraid of being buried in a foreign land?" And safety answers, "Does it matter where I'm buried?" And so forth, the laughter at death. And here we see death again in the Documenti d'Amore, like love, amor, amor, morte, which Dante will play with in the Francesco and Paolo episode. Death shooting arrows at everyone, and we had also the figure of death shooting arrows in the tomb sculpted by Tino da Camarino. And next we turn to the paleography. Teresa de Robertis has pointed out that there are manuscripts written in litera textualis by Francesco de Barberino, which he signs, but also manuscripts written by him in Cancelleresca, which he signs, including those by Dante. And I think that when he is copying out Brunetto, he uses the rounded litera textualis because that reflects on Brunetto's hand. And when he copies out the manuscripts of Dante, he copies out them in Cancelleresca because that imitates the hand that Dante was using. And here we see the other Francesco de Barberino in his atrocious writing. It's really awful. Et ego Franciscus Neri de Barberino. And here we see Ser Francesco Zernadi de Barberino in this lovely Cancelleresca. And then we have these three manuscripts, which are really interesting. This is Palatino 313, which is one of the earliest comedias. It's kind of sandboxing how to do the illustrations, how to set out the text. It doesn't set out the text very well. It's still stumbling around, and it has connections with a relative of Dante, not the Forese Dante Donati who's in the Inferno, but a similarly named Forese Donati. And but when it comes to Piccarda Donati in the Purgatorio, it has a very lovely, rather unusual illustration for her. And there are figures in the text where Dante is shown in Francesca de Barberino's pink rosa, and others where he is shown not in Francesca de Barberino's iconography, but in the more typical blue student text. And then this is that miscellaneous manuscript in Latin which I associate with Francesca de Barberino, and which includes texts by Merlin and the Sibyl, which are also reflected in the Tesoro by, I think, Dante. in its Chronica section. And then this is the Tesoretto, which I think is by Francesco de Barberino. And we see all of them having these beautiful alternating blue and red initials, and then the text in the normal mode. And then we have this from the Tesoro and this from the Documenti. When Francesco writes out his own texts, his hand becomes a bit more slovenly. But some of the writing reflects those didascalia, those labels to the figures that he gives to the figures in the miniatures in the Tesoretto. And here we see how he writes in the Commedia when he's copying Dante, and how he writes when he's copying Brunetto, but with the same beautiful rustic capitals and so forth. And here we see the Tesoro, and here we see the Commedia, and here we see him in the Bargello. Antonio d'Orso, who dies in 1321, the bishop. A figure we don't know who it is. Uh, This one I identify with Brunetto in his teaching robes of ermine and red. Corso Donati Podesta, whom Vasari says is here, and Dante Alighieri, who dies in 1321, the same year that Antonio d'Orso dies. And then here, Francesco de Barberino in his pink, a married cleric, kneeling because he's alive and he's the donor of this. And then Francesco de Barberino will die in 1348 of for one of the early victims of the plague. And his epitaph is written by Boccaccio in Santa Croce, Boccaccio carrying on this tradition that Francesco had started of editing Dante's Commedia and of creating commentaries to it. And this is the Editio Princeps, which was printed in Treviso in 1474, using a manuscript by Francesco, which goes back to the early version of 1260, omitting the later chronicle sections, in which both the manuscript he creates, which is now in the Laurentian, and this printed edition say that Brunetto creates this text for love of his enemy, suo nemico, who is Carlo d'Anjou and also Corso Donati, for whom he is working. And then this is my edition for the Regione Toscana, with which won the MLA approved edition seal. And it's only printed in 100 copies, so it's rather valuable. But the texts are also completely on the DVD, and most of them are present on the website, which you can find Opere Brunetto Latino. And also in the Dante Vivo, you will have all of the Commedia with the miniatures, with the oral readings, and with the music, as well as the music being on the YouTube, finding it on La Musica della Commedia playlist. So may you be recommended to my tesoro, in which I still live, says Brunetto to Dante, and I think to us today as we continue this work of valuing his tesoro. And that is the conclusion of my Academia Bessarion. In the Italian version, we had a lovely discussion that continued, and I wish I could present it here. But today I'm just alone doing this, and thank you very much for paying attention to this. And now we will end the condivisione, And we will also end the Zoom broadcast.